It all began when the protagonist got kicked out of a party for the millionth time after being dumped by countless others before. Now broke and fed up with the vicious cycle, Alden decided to take down a dungeon boss alone because that was his last hope of surviving as an adventurer. Since he was at level 43, he was strong enough to survive the first few floors, but he soon landed on one floor with a paralyzing slime releasing sticky fluid that could weaken a grown man. Despite this, Alden was so excited about the expected coin drops from the slime that he successfully defeated it in anticipation of a massive reward. Unfortunately, Alden got no reward, but he wasn't surprised, because he had a cursed skill that reduced his chances of getting rewards. This forced him to defeat 100 times more enemies than an average adventurer just to get the same number of rewards, so people generally hated him for this and kicked him out of their parties. Suddenly, Alden's thoughts were interrupted by a loud voice belonging to a priestess who was attacked by a horde of goblins. Soon after recognizing that these were above-average goblins, Alden quickly stepped in and got rid of them, but as their numbers reduced, a larger horde attempted to sneak an attack on him. He easily wiped them out while protecting himself using a barrier, but he noticed the last goblin was headed for the priestess, so he quickly alerted her, and she bashed its ugly head. When they reached a safe point, the priestess thanked him and introduced herself as Coco. After, Alden wondered why Coco was alone and assumed the goblins had gobbled up her party members, but she shared that she'd always been alone. Alden said she was being stupidly reckless, but when she revealed she was level 80, he was shocked and felt like an embarrassment to the Brotherhood since this girl was nearly twice his level. However, Coco showed him her skill set, and he realized that she was at such a high level because of a negative skill that stole the rewards of other party members and used them to boost her points. Such members could still get the drops and experience points, but the slaying bonus was all given to Coco, and their special skills were also nullified. After estimating the compatibility of both their negative skills, Virgin Alden grabbed Coco's arms thinking they were rice cakes, as he desperately begged her to form a party with him. Initially, she resisted the idea, but after much convincing, she later agreed to form a temporary party with him. Getting into the dungeon, they encountered another paralyzing slime, so Alden seized the opportunity to watch how his negative skill would interact with Coco's. When he defeated the slime, the coin drop was unbelievably huge, but he still didn't feel convinced, so he went on to defeat more creatures until he was rewarded with a lightning orb. Finally, it dawned upon him that his fate had changed, and he was now getting lucky with rewards. He wasted no time in asking Coco to form a party with him, but she said they were already in one together. However, Alden said what he really meant was that he wanted them to be together forever, and Coco blushed because she thought this loser was proposing marriage. At the same time, Alden revealed that he also had a negative skill that reduced rewards, and the surprised Coco wondered how he ever survived as an adventurer. However, Alden said his fate had now changed because on his very first adventure with her, he gained significant rewards which he'd never seen his whole life. Hearing this, Coco was shocked, saying her skill only ever caused trouble for everyone, but Alden explained that since her skill normally canceled out the skills of party members, it also canceled out his own negative skill, which in turn made him a normal swordsman. After this explanation, Coco finally understood that by asking her to stay together forever, Alden was only asking her to remain in the same party with him even after leaving the dungeon. Of course, she was a little bummed out that her cherry would remain unpopped, but she smiled because finally, her cursed skill had come in handy for someone else. Still, Alden said she could take her time before making a decision, but for now, they could be teammates just to conquer that dungeon. After some time, they arrived at the middle floor, and Alden kept getting lots of coin drops and many other treasures for each monster he conquered. Seeing this, Alden was so excited because he had never thought he would ever see his storage filled with drops. He asked Coco to help him gather them, and in his heart, he felt thankful to her and thought of her as a friend who was hard to come by. However, Alden noticed that Coco seemed to be having mood swings, so he suggested that they take a break. Coco said she was fine to keep going, but Alden, sounding desperate, said that she could share whatever she had on her mind with him, and he would fix it. Coco blushed because she couldn't say exactly what was on her mind, so she lied that she noticed him defeating monsters easily with one swing of his blade and wondered if he was using a special sword. Alden said that all he had to do was target the weak points of the monsters, and it was especially easier for him with Coco's strength-enhancing buff. However, Coco said it was still pretty insane that Alden could destroy monsters with one hit, and he told her he had studied so much that he wouldn't drag anyone down with his skill. Frankly speaking, he only wanted to flex his inner alpha male because he was scared that she'd give up on him. As they were speaking, they sighted a treasure box in the distance, and Alden told Coco to stay back just in case it was a trap. He opened it only to find a scroll confirming rumors about the boss drop, saying it could help the user eliminate one of their skills. However, Alden suddenly realized that he hadn't been thinking about this item because his negative skill was nullified, and Coco, almost echoing his thoughts, said that if only one person could use the item from the boss drop, she would prefer that Alvin use it. Alvin was surprised, wondering why she brought that up out of the blue, but Coco said that she realized the boss drop could only be used once and she owed him for rescuing her earlier. It suddenly occurred to Alvin that this was what had been bothering Coco, which made her look so sad. However, he told her that they should sell the item drop because experience points meant nothing to him, and what he craved most importantly was someone to go on adventures with. Besides, with a partner like Coco, he could deal with his negative skill, so he was pretty happy continuing in that way. However, Coco said he only felt that way for now and eventually would get fed up when he realized his experience points were being stolen by her and he wasn't getting significant rewards for his achievements, because that was how it always played out among her teammates. As Coco spoke, Alvin realized that she really had it all in her head, and he remembered that when he was much younger, he learned that negative skills were more emotional problems that brought out feelings such as envy, suspicion, and servility in anyone who was cursed with them. Up until this moment, Alvin realized all this while he'd also been acting like Coco, who looked like a grandma on her last legs, so he knew just exactly what to tell her. He then got down on one knee, saying that as an adventurer in a similar situation to hers, he would never betray her. When he realized he looked like a simp crawling out of the trenches, he quickly got up and said that they shouldn't worry about the boss drop because they weren't certain that it could only be used once. Finally, his words got to Coco, and she smiled and apologized for sounding weird earlier. As they turned to proceed, Coco felt thankful because Alvin was actually a pretty honest dude for someone who was that strong, and she felt their meeting was fate. But then, the dark, wounded part of her soul felt their encounter was all too convenient, and perhaps it was only because of her skill that Alvin was tagging along, which made him no different from other adventurers. However, she remembered that he promised never to betray her, and whatever dark thoughts she had were shattered in that instant, so she learned to trust him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash, and they both ran in the direction of the crash, only to find several golems gathered. They soon suspected that there had to be an adventurer somewhere around who had been completely surrounded by golems. And so, Alvin used his iron cutter and sliced through the bodies of the golems, but it was a pretty tough exterior, so he asked Coco to buff him up since he had already drawn the monster's attention away from the adventurer. Unfortunately, golems were pretty tough to deal with because they were made of emerald and had strong physical resistance. To defeat so many golems quickly, Coco had to chant the best buff she could, because her most sincere desire was to enhance Alvin's abilities with all her might rather than worry about anything else. In that instance, she granted him a buff that allowed him to pass through thick things like her posterior. Successfully, Alvin shattered the golem and commended Coco on a great job because her buff had saved him so much time. At that time, more golems were arriving in their direction, so Alvin told the trapped adventurer that he would take out as many as he could to begin with, and he defeated the golems one after the other with Coco's help until they had got rid of every last one of them. Afterwards, he said he was pretty surprised that her buff lasted until he beat all the golems, so she could only have lasted that long because she was at level 80. After a word, they met the trapped adventurer, who turned out to be a mage, but then she apologized to them, saying it was a trap because the ceiling and walls jutted out intricately, which caused the golems in the passageway to get clogged. And since emerald golems didn't have long-range attacks, the girl could mow them down easily to get as much money as she wanted. Alvin apologized, realizing she was the one who drew the golems towards her, but she said it was not a big deal because she was just there by chance. Immediately, Alvin assumed she had gone to defeat the boss, but the girl said there was no way that could happen because she was a mage and that kind of job was not suited for soloing, so she couldn't solo a boss without a party. However, she admitted that she needed the boss drop so she could get rid of her negative skill. Moments later, the girl introduced herself as Melina, and they told her the story of how they met and both had negative skills. After, Melina told them about her own negative skill, which was called the Blessing of the Jealous God, and which was why she couldn't join a party and was going solo as a mage. Apparently, her negative skill worked by increasing the stats of everyone in the party, including hers, by 10%. However, upon defeating a monster, the one who defeated it would have their stats decreased by 3% for each monster that was defeated. After a good number of monsters were slain, starting from the 4th monster, Melina's cursed skill would decrease an adventurer's stats, including their very initial base stats. However, Alvin said this wasn't much of a big deal, as he had run the calculations, and it was rare for the negative skill to decrease someone's stats enough to be an obstacle in combat. But Melina said the effect which really caused problems for her party members was the 3rd, which was taking bonuses away from the person who defeated the monster and dividing them among the other members of the party. For example, if a swordsman defeated 2 monsters, a mage defeated 1, and a cleric defeated none, the bonuses of the swordsman would be distributed to the mage and cleric, while the bonuses of the mage would be distributed to the cleric and the swordsman. Following this explanation, Melina asked Alvin what he would do if he were a combatant who lost his bonuses and suffered a stat debuff every time he defeated a monster, and he said he would try to get other party members to defeat as many monsters as possible. This was precisely what Melina thought of as a problem because it landed most of them in a dangerous situation that could lead to accidents. She believed that in dungeons, no matter how much damage an adventurer received from a flashy attack, the only consequence was that their health points decreased, but their performance wouldn't suffer. However, the moment a person's health points approached zero, they would die and couldn't be revived with any healing spells or items. On the other hand, people might begin to argue in the team over who should deal the final blow to a wounded monster in front of them. And Celine, having witnessed countless parties on the verge of collapse due to a monster's desperate final attack, voluntarily left such parties, or the party members would turn hostile towards her and kick her out. As a result, she preferred to go solo because she couldn't imagine someone else dying because of her skill. Although going solo was better, it was still pretty dangerous, and so she decided to explore the cavern because she heard that the boss drop had an item that erased skills, and she began mapping a route to the boss. Meanwhile, Alvin thought deeply about Melina's skill, realizing it could be fatal, but if her skill was applied to someone like him, he wouldn't care about his bonuses getting taken and redistributed to the others because he didn't need the bonuses. However, the one who would die at their party was poor Coco. Meanwhile, Melina said she planned to earn so much money by trapping and defeating golems so she could get enough money to hire people to help her out whenever she decided to challenge the boss, but until then, she was stuck moving like an abandoned witch. However, Coco aggressively held her, asking her to join their party, but the way she grabbed Melina made her want to scream mummy. Melina realized this one hadn't been listening to her all this time, but Coco said she'd been listening. Melina explained on a serious note that if Alvin ever hesitated to defeat a monster, then Coco's life would be in danger. However, Coco ignored all that because she had a theory that she wanted them to test out, and in the end, Melina was forced to cooperate with them. Arriving at the 24th floor of the cavern, Coco said they would try to defeat some monsters as a party. At the same time, Alvin realized that all his stats had increased by 10%. The first monster that approached them was a tentacle plant, and at the speed of light, Melina incanted a chant and defeated the monster in one hit. The other two were astonished at this, so Melina said it was pretty easy for her as long as she hit a monster with its elemental weakness. When they asked her what elemental magic she used, she said she used all 5 elements, which were each trained up to level 38, and all she had to do was choose the best element for the job. Coco felt her level was impressive but couldn't believe that Melina could use 5 elements. And she explained that she was fussing about this because there were an enormous number of magic spells. There were different elements, and each element required mages to learn a different chant. So the higher their levels, the more spells were available for them to learn. This only meant that Melina wasn't only using 5 elements, but that she had a tremendous memory and had all the chants memorized. Melina confirmed this by saying she knew she had 5 types of elemental enhancing skills, and because of her negative skill, she worked hard to memorize every single incantation because she couldn't stand the thought of having someone die because of her negative skill. This was why Coco had nothing but respect for Melina, because even her own few cleric spells made her use up the brain cells she never had. Later, Coco remembered they had to check the party stats, and she saw a melting heart icon representing the jealous god curse, which Melina claimed had only affected her because it was she who defeated the monster. However, both Alvin and Coco stared at the screen silently, saying nothing. Coco eventually said that she noticed a 3% reduction in all the stats, but Melina said she didn't seem to have gotten the debuff as expected. For more confirmation, they decided to defeat another monster, which happened to be another emerald golem. But since Marina was the rear guard, she couldn't handle that, and Alvin decided instead to take care of it himself. With one magic fire as a cover, the golem staggered, and the bits of it were shattered, which was quite surprising, even to Alvin. Afterwards, Alvin used a thrasher skill and sliced right through the golem, and it was instantly defeated, even without any buff from Coco. Alvin was surprised because it meant the golem only had enough health points to take one blow from the thrasher and be defeated. As Melina helped Alvin, they asked Coco how the stats were looking, and all she did was say she couldn't understand what was happening and enthusiastically asked Melina to join their party. Afterwards, she played the Together Forever card, but Melina said it was embarrassing to hear that out of the blue, and she preferred sausages to peaches. However, Coco instantly remembered that she just did precisely the same thing that Alvin had done, so she explained that she wanted Melina to stay at their party even after leaving the cavern. However, Melina said she had already explained that she couldn't be part of a party. And so, Coco and Alvin said they also had negative skills. After they both told her about the individual negative skills and the effects they had, Melina understood that all three of them were there for the same reason. However, she felt they were asking her to join them out of sympathy, so she didn't want any kind of sympathy. Coco said she wasn't, nobody was doing it out of sympathy, so she told Melina to check the party stats. Melina was shocked to realize that she didn't have the Jealous God's curse and had received the Tentacle Plant's bonus after defeating it. Not to mention that Coco had 2 Jealous God's curses on her own tab. And so Coco explained that this happened because whenever a party member defeated a monster, it was Coco who got the credit for that reward. Meaning Melina's curse of the Jealous God applied a debuff to whoever slaughtered or slew a monster. However, due to Coco's curse, she would be the one getting credit for such monster defeats, meaning the experience points stolen from her would return to everyone. However, Melina was concerned that Coco would never get another bonus. Coco said she didn't mind, and Alvin said he was happy knowing the bonuses would always be split between them because defeating monsters was never the result of one person's effort. Yet, Melina was happy that the curse would always fall completely on Coco, so her stats would decrease by 3% each time. To reassure her, Coco said she could use a clerical spell known as Cleanse, and if the debuffs affected her too much, she could easily get rid of them. Melina seemed not to be convinced until Coco told her she was at level 80, and even with all her stats halved, she should be better than a typical cleric and would be able to fulfill her role as a healer. Besides, all these years, Coco felt ashamed that she was the only one leveling up in her parties and had failed to return the experience points she wasn't deliberately stealing. Hearing this, Alvin chipped in and tried convincing Melina to stay in their party just for a while because that would be safer than going solo, and it could give her a chance to find the boss and earn money. Eventually, Melina agreed, saying it was for a short time, and Coco high-fived her. Moments later, the team conquered more monsters and Alvin got a rare gemstone as a drop, but he handed it over to Melina as repayment for unknowingly stealing her golems when he tried to save her. However, she told him to keep it, because he did it from a pure intention and she didn't want him to think it was a bad thing to rescue people. Afterwards, they discussed that the dungeon was surprisingly deep, and since they had no map of the lower levels, Melina was worried about how far the dungeon went. Alvin initially suggested that they rest for a bit, but neither of the girls was tired and said he should rest instead because he was taking a whole bunch of the burden from them. However, he called the whole thing a walk in the park because the girls were excellent support and his negative skill was gone. Just then, Alvin saw a text stating that a swordsman's stretch to wield a sword would wither away, a bowman's eyes would become cloudy, but the last part of the message was coded. Alvin realized that this text was pretty similar to the text at the dungeon's entrance, so perhaps there was some hint somewhere. On her own, Melina was lost in thought about the boss drop because she knew all three of them wanted to erase their negative skills, but wasn't sure how they planned to handle it, so she asked them who would take the item. Even though the others thought boss drops were single-use, Melina knew there could be multiple copies of the item, but all the possibilities in her head seemed to draw her deeper into despair. When her teammates noticed it, they told her to chill because they'd worry about it only after getting the drop. Alvin then told her that they may acquire new information as they progress, or someone may have already got a hold of the boss drop before them, so it was best for them to focus on doing what they could so they get the boss drop. Melina seemed to be moved by his speech and acknowledged that Alvin and Coco were quite selfless, unlike most adventurers she'd worked with before. Eventually, she agreed that the best way to move forward was to worry after getting their hands on the boss's drop. To begin their journey, Alvin suggested they search for a safe point on the floor, but suddenly, they heard an awful scream, and right behind them, a guy was running from some monsters. Immediately, Alvin's team decided to step in and Melina offered to go first, saying she would cast a ranged spell, but Alvin was worried because the adventurer guy they saw running was still just up ahead. However, Melina said that they should simply give a signal for the guy to dodge to the left as soon as her spell activated. Alvin said he would give the signal, while Coco said she would buff the electric element. So Alvin called out to the guy and said that he should wait for a signal and dodge into a hole by the side. Since the bozo only understood the language of women, he looked to the ladies and saw them casting spells, and he realized that there was a ranged spell on his way that he should dodge. As soon as they cast the spell, Alden commanded the guy to dodge, and as soon as he did, the magical attack consumed all the monsters there at once. While the guy luckily found himself safely tucked away in the hole, Alden was impressed and also commended Melina for spotting that hiding spot for the guy because he would never have. Some more monsters came up, but they were much fewer in number, so the team decided to take them down individually and the guy offered to join in as well. Alden was telling him not to bother himself, so he would just rest, but before he knew it, Lil Bro was defying gravity like Spider-Man because his health points were maxed out. In no time, all the monsters were defeated, and much later, the guy apologized for attracting the huge pack of monsters but also said Alden was pretty strong and had saved him. He introduced himself as Ted, saying he was a thief but not the type to steal girls' hearts, but rather did most of his thieving inside the dungeons because that was the classification of his stats, like a swordsman or mage. The others introduced themselves, and Alden told Ted that they had formed a temporary party. He asked about Ted, and the guy said, even though he looked like an imp, he was at a pretty high level himself. However, Melina felt Ted had no right to claim he was a high-level adventurer, because he screamed like a little girl earlier on. The coward claimed that he only screamed because the monsters nearly overpowered him, and then he told them he wasn't soloing the lower floors because he was searching for treasure chests, contrary to what they may have thought. Meanwhile, Alden was in his head, thinking up reasons why Ted would be soloing the dungeons, because he knew thieves didn't have to engage in combat to earn a living. The only logical solution he came up with was that Ted was exploring the dungeon because he also had a negative skill. But Ted surprised him, saying that if they had come down to the dungeon believing the rumor about the boss drop being an item that erased negative skills, then they had been scammed, because that was a big fat lie. Melina was upset, but Ted explained that if they were born with those skills, it meant they were stuck with them for life, and no convenient item existed in their world which could break that rule. Despite Ted's negative remarks, Melina was pretty confident in her research results, which revealed that there existed an item that could strip away skills. But Ted said he was a thief who knew a lot about items and had never encountered any that could alter anyone's skills permanently. Melina said it was too early to say for sure because there were tons of skills that hadn't even been heard of, but at some point, Ted put on a naughty expression, saying it was hard for him to prove that something didn't exist, but they certainly were going on a fool's errand. Alden said that all three of them doubted the existence of such an item long before they embarked on their journey individually to the dungeon, but as a team, they had come so far. Ted adamantly said that it didn't matter whether they were already prepared to be disappointed because he knew for sure that the boss's room was on floor 40. At this revelation, Alden kept quiet and was shocked because the floor was a lot deeper than he expected. The general recommendation for such boss raids was a number of at least 4 people with an average level equal to the floor number plus 10. In terms of level, they were okay but didn't have enough people. And Ted further pointed out that no matter how strong they were, a boss raid with only 3 people would be pretty tough. Instantly, Melina understood Ted's tantrums to be that he wanted to join their party. However, he blatantly denied this, saying it was way too risky to venture into the depths with a temporary party. Alden said it wasn't time for them to turn back just yet, and together with the other girls, he planned to first confirm whether there were truly up to 40 floors and then find out what the boss's element and attack patterns were so they could come up with a perfect plan to challenge it. Ted, feeling abandoned like a stray cat, joined in their conversation, saying he would show them the way to the boss's floor and precisely to the boss's room. They were all surprised, and Ted said he had been right in front of the boss's door but didn't get in because he had no interest in any boss battles. Alden thanked him for his help but asked him why he was doing that, and Ted said he noticed they were willing to go even though he tried stopping them, so leading them and showing them the way was his own way of apologizing for the trouble he caused. As they all prepared to set out, Ted handed them some poison resistance potions so they wouldn't get afflicted with poison. But Coco said that if they needed any poison resistance, she could have easily cast a buff. However, Ted said all the monsters beyond that point inflicted poison, and it would be much better to have a longer-acting potion than a short-acting buff. He first downed a vial of the potion, and then Alden did the same after seeing he could trust Ted's potion. But suddenly, Alden's body felt weak and paralyzed, and he slumped to the ground, realizing that Ted had deceived and poisoned them with a paralytic substance. Apparently, the vial Ted drank was actually a real poison resistance potion, which had a similar color to the paralytic potion he had given Alden. As Alden lay on the floor, he noticed that Melina was also paralyzed and that there were 2 empty vials, but that made him wonder whether Coco had also taken one. He actually realized that he got so carried away by Ted's smooth-talking that he forgot to check the name of the item since he was a muscle for brains, and so blamed himself for everything that had happened. Right then, Ted took his hand to open his status window and steal some of his rewards. His next victim was supposed to be Melina, but suddenly Coco showed up right behind him with eyes that could reduce any man to dust, and she lifted her staff and banged it on his head. Instantly, he sprang to his feet and took out his little knife to defend himself, but he expressed his surprise at the fact that Coco wasn't paralyzed even though he had seen her taking the potion he had given them. Coco said she drank it, but thanks to her paralysis-resistant skill, nothing affected her. Just then, Ted realized his health power was significantly low and he asked Coco what she had done. And that was when he found out that she was at level 80 and obviously had enough power to reduce his health points with one hit. At that time, Ted was already feeling dizzy and surrendered because his health power wasn't enough for him to put up any fight. Moments later, after Coco had cured both Alvin and Melina, they helped her to physically restrain him with a rope and she suggested that they head back and hand him over to the guild. However, Melina, who was completely outraged, suggested that instead they should push him in front of a pack of mermen, but she later said she was joking when they told her she was being a little too harsh. However, she also pointed out that perhaps Ted had tried to get them murdered by monsters the very first time they saw him. However, Ted claimed it was truly an accident, so Coco said they would just let the guild deal with him. Alvin was deep thinking about the whole thing, realizing that Ted must be a real scoundrel if he actually tried getting them to be murdered by the horde of monsters. But again, he couldn't trust whether Ted's actions were accidental or intentional. Melina spoke up that she agreed with Coco's decision to let the guild deal with him because it was impossible to carry Ted everywhere with them and also too dangerous to leave him there and let him out of their sight. Coco asked Alvin whether he agreed with that, because she had a memory map in her hand, which could let them return to the entrance no matter where and what level they were at in a dungeon. But Alvin said that they should hold off on leaving because there was a very good chance that Ted would escape before they could get him to the guild. Probably because Ted possessed a skill that could help him slip out of the ropes they tied him in. Ted said Alvin was overthinking things, but Alvin said the reason behind Ted looking this chill was that he knew he could easily escape at any point. In any case, Alvin said that he had once been taught by his sword master to try to figure out the things that had been nagging at him. About Ted's attack on them, firstly, he asked Ted why he only stole items that were necessary for them to continue adventuring, because the items were potions, food, and spare equipment, but he didn't even touch one of the most important items, which was a rare drop known as the Merman's Tear. This was because there was no reasonable person who really just wanted to steal who could overlook the Merman's Tear. So this meant that Ted was actually trying to stop them from progressing any further, and not just a simple attempt to rob them. At the time, Ted bowed his head in frustration because he had been figured out, so he told them to go home without a fuss. Melina figured that there was something he wasn't telling them, so when they urged him, he confessed that because they had saved his life, he figured it was his duty to stop them, but at that point, he no longer cared, and they could just challenge the boss, and say hi to his ex in the fiery abyss. Everyone stared intently at him, and Coco asked whether he knew something about the boss that he could share. But Ted said it didn't matter since they no longer trusted him. Alvin shared that even though he found Ted's approach problematic, it was clear that Ted was actually trying to stop them from challenging the boss because they were completely unprepared for that fight. He then told Ted that, depending on the circumstances, if he told them what was really up, they could turn back for the time being. After a while, Ted finally confessed that the boss of that dungeon had a deadly secret, which was why no one could beat it. He asked them if they had a map of the lower levels of that dungeon, but they told him that the shop map did not have any such maps. Ted told them to think about it because it was pretty odd, since usually there were at least some fragmentary maps sold to earn extra cash by some parties that had attempted the raid. And in the absence of any such maps, it is simply because none of the parties that attempted the raid has ever returned. Immediately, Alvin spoke up, saying that it was ridiculous because adventurers who could make it to the 40th floor would definitely be very cautious. But Ted snickered at his comment, saying that he had once told them there were a bunch of poison-type monsters beyond the current point they were at, but as long as they could deal with the poison, it wasn't impossible to reach the boss's room. So, usually, whenever cautious adventurers arrived at the boss floor, they would assume they weren't too tired to venture in. And just as they entered the door, which closed shut on its own, and no adventurers ever left. In fact, the very fact that the dungeon was still present only meant that no single adventurer had cleared it, and if the parties who made it to the boss floor never returned, it only meant that they were slain by the boss of the dungeon. This also meant that once that door got shut by itself, there was no chance for anyone to retreat, and all that awaited such adventurers was either victory or death. As they discussed further, Coco said she had challenged a fair number of boss rooms that spawned on lower floors, and she observed that it was normal for adventurers to be unable to retreat from boss rooms because they had special mechanics. Ted chipped in that it was so because they didn't want the adventurers to tell others about the traps inside them. However, if there were special conditions, there would be clues within the dungeons, such as similar traps or flavor text. After thinking, Coco added that a boss room in such an empty dungeon wouldn't be the type that prevented adventurers from withdrawing. Realizing that Coco had a point, Molina simply concluded that Ted was again still lying through his teeth. He started acting frantically, saying that if all it took to conquer a small dungeon was a high number of adventurers with high levels, and perhaps the boss had an obscure secret gimmick, then it was a waste of time. As Ted spoke, Molina was silently observing and noted that he seemed excessively knowledgeable about that dungeon, so she asked him exactly why he came to the dungeon, because he wasn't even after the treasure chests on the lower floors. Also, since there were no maps or people who returned from the lower floors, Ted shouldn't have known that there were lower levels when he entered. The final giveaway was that Ted certainly had to have seen countless parties entering the boss's room to conclude that it wasn't possible to retreat and that the boss was unbeatable. This only meant Ted had not been challenging the boss with the other adventurers, which was pretty strange. Following this analysis, Molina rephrased her question, asking why Ted was hanging out in front of the boss's room, but the idiot said that they should ask Alvin because it seemed the nerd of all nerds had already figured it out. Even though it was just an intelligent guess, Alvin said that Ted saw all other adventurers as enemies who competed with him for limited resources. But things weren't always this way. When Ted was younger, he once heard a story about adventurers who, rather than competing with each other, shared and overcame their hardships together. At a young age, Ted barely became an adventurer but knew he couldn't stay greedy if he wanted to keep friends around. However, one time, after he had helped his party members with all his last ounce of strength, Ted was abandoned when he became weak and helpless, and so he swore never to join a party again. Since he was a thief by profession, he realized getting boss drops would be easy if he simply snatched the drops once a different party defeated the boss. That was Ted's original plan, and he confessed that he was just lying in wait for a chance to rob the adventurers once they got that boss drop. At that point, Coco was furious and said that since he had already confessed and they could take him directly to the guild. But Alvin said that Ted was largely unprepared, which meant he wasn't in the actual habit of robbing people, and this was a special case for him in which he had no other option or way out because he actually had a negative skill. Ted confirmed that Alvin was right and asked him how he knew. So Alvin shared that while he fought the merman, he noticed that Ted made use of a variety of skills, even though he didn't know which ones precisely. Alvin also knew that people with negative skills tended to have many more skills, so everything started to add up. However, obviously, Ted's plan to rob people of the boss completely failed because he had watched countless skilled adventurers fail the raid. The guy said he had warned such adventurers that it was dangerous, but no one listened to him because adventurers are actually stupidos. However, when he encountered Alvin's party, he decided to give them a heads up because he considered them friends ever since they went far to protect him from the merman, even if it cost him the boss drop and failed to get rid of his negative skills. The others asked what Ted's negative skill was, and he said it was a hunter becoming the hunted kind of troublesome skill. How it worked was that all the debuffs the party received would go straight to Ted, and he added no further context. All three of the others were shocked because this was a pretty bad thing, as every single person would be throwing debuffs in Ted's direction. However, Coco found it very weird that he only got the debuffs because it meant his skill distinguished between buffs and debuffs. Typically, the differences between buffs and debuffs are distinctions adventurers make on their own, but it was ultra rare that a skill Ted possessed could make this distinction for him. However, Ted said nothing was interesting about his skill being a rare one because it had brought him nothing but pain. However, Coco said it's certainly hard to be advantageous to Ted because if the whole party was hit with a low vitality reduction debuff, then it meant Ted would be the only one affected. But Ted said his own wasn't so convenient, and the severity of the debuff increased with each stack. However, if he received a bunch of different debuffs, he was pretty screwed. He went on to share that back then, when he got abandoned by his teammates, All his stats were cut by more than half and he was severely weak, but the idiots all left him to die by himself, and since then, he had only been going on solo adventures. Melina said she found it a little strange that Ted's stats were more than halved, but he thought she was really refusing to believe a word he said. To his surprise, she said she really wanted to understand, and her closeness to him made him explode in his diapers. Melina then shared that Ted's cursed skill didn't stack debuffs but rather raised their severity. So even if 4 people received debuffs of medium severity, the max severity for debuffs was X, and it wouldn't exceed that, meaning Ted's skills wouldn't be halved. However, he told her some debuffs combined to double the effects because his negative skill had another effect, which increased or decreased the effectiveness of his stats based on the reward rate of the party. This depended on the members, especially those who had skills that increased their chances of receiving rewards, such as money, good luck, and increased drop rate. Back then, when Ted was still in the party, they had a temporary member who joined midway through the dungeon who possessed a drop rate increase and good luck. The effect of Ted's debuffs rose, and he became careless. The other group members asked him whether there were times when the debuff effects decreased, and he said he acknowledged that they could work the other way around if a party member had skills like bad luck or a decreased drop rate. However, he didn't know by how much the debuffs could increase and didn't care either because he had no intention of joining the party anymore. Besides, he felt that if such a poor party with terrible drops wanted to hire him, there was no way on earth he would ever want to join them. Hearing his words, Alvin felt like a church rat and fainted, so his girls tried to get him up. Ted didn't understand what was going on and asked what had suddenly got into them, but they told him to make an educated guess, even though he was outright illiterate. He eventually figured out that these party members had a reduced drop rate and bad luck, so having him in their party would negate the effects of the low severity debuffs. This time around, Melina stepped forward and invited him to join their party, but Ted reminded her that he had just said he would never join a party. However, Melina urged him to try them for just 2 or 3 fights because nothing bad could happen. Probably. But seeing how unwilling he was to give them a shot, Alvin threw in a bribe, his rare merman's gift, and instantly, without thinking, Ted set himself free from the binds and escaped so easily. Afterwards, they asked him again whether he was willing to join them, and he said he was glad to. After everything, Coco apologized to him for hitting it from behind, but said she wouldn't mind doing it again, while Ted responded that it was cool. Meanwhile, Melina and Alvin were behind, and Melina said it was a little too generous of Alvin to let go of his merman's tear just to get Ted to tag along with them. On the other hand, Alvin was philosophizing as usual and asked Melina why they had all come to that dungeon specifically, and she replied that they had come to erase their negative skills. Her next plan afterwards would be to join up with a party officially because she wanted to go on adventures she couldn't do by herself and wanted to attain new heights. Alvin agreed with her that being part of a party was one of the best experiences, but he also felt that that was exactly what Ted wanted, and that was precisely why he thought it was a great chance for Ted to team up with them even just for a while. Just then, Ted asked if they were headed down to the lower levels, and Alvin responded that they were going to start by searching for monsters that cast debuffs beyond them to see the effects of Ted's negative skill. Ted was excited, saying that since they had given him something as good as the mermaid's tear, he would lead them straight to the boss's room. However, he slipped over an icy patch and fell flat on his face. Very soon, he told everyone to hold up because there was a frost chimera right at that spot. The members were instantly surprised because this frost chimera was a powerful monster, so they all wondered what to do and suggested retreating. As they stepped away, Ted's heart skipped a beat after hearing them mention retreat, because that was not his safe word. He also saw them all running and leading him behind, just as his teammates from the last party had run away and even used him as a decoy. Ted realized that his reality was pretty sad because he thought these guys were at least his friends, and that was all he ever had, so he realized that he had been abandoned to die. Coco had been calling out to him all this while, but he was so lost in thought that he didn't notice. Eventually, she got him back on his feet and he realized that Alvin had gotten to the chimera, giving Ted a chance to escape. Watching everything, Ted was surprised that they actually didn't run away and that Alvin had only retreated temporarily to get an item that would increase his chances of winning against the chimera. In any case, Alvin believed that with their current strength, they could easily continue their battle and not give up. Convinced that no one was running away or leaving him behind, Ted agreed to join them. Just then, the Chimera launched towards them, and Alden warned against an incoming ice breath that could affect everyone, including those at the rear, but Ted stepped forward and asked Alden to back him up while he executed his plan. After, he attacked the serpent head of the Chimera, and successfully hindered its breath attack, but this shocked Alden because he never expected that Ted could cause the Chimera to even stagger. Afterwards, Melina struck the beast with lightning and it tried to escape, but before Alden could steady himself for an attack, Ted had already caught up swiftly with the Chimera and sliced it into 2 clean halves. Eventually, the defeated body of the Chimera crashed to the ground, but Ted's teammates were speechless and in utmost shock as they watched Ted's shocking performance and acknowledged his brilliance. They commended him for doing a good job, but this reminded him of the past, when he all thought adventurers were fools for trusting each other, but now, he knew he was only envious because he had never experienced the joy they all enjoy from having loyal teammates. Now that he had found his own group of people, he smiled and reunited with them, knowing he was at home. After everything, they all found out that this was Ted's first time encountering a Chimera, because he had only guessed the weak spot to be the serpent head, and he hit it accurately. The others were eager to know what sort of skill granted him the knowledge of monsters' weak spots, but he said it was simply by adopting the mindset of the person who created the monsters. Seeing that his teammates didn't know anything about the creator of the Chimera, Ted told them that their world was a simulation, and he figured that someone must have created it. They all brought up their counter-arguments about how monsters and dungeons naturally were, but it said that it was all because the world was balanced, which was why a monster's weak point wouldn't be in an unnoticeable position but rather in a reasonable place and with understandable movement patterns. Ted seemed pretty proud of himself, thinking this was a special technique that he had learned through countless battles, but Alden said that it sounded more like he had feral intuition. While everyone was arguing against Ted's theory, Coco was locked in, staring at her screen and realizing that her negative skill had never activated during their fight. This happened precisely as they predicted, and they were all happy to experience yet another miracle in their team. But when Ted saw that they were all huddled up, whispering among themselves, he told them they would have to test his debuff skill again on the next monster, and they all eagerly agreed to, saying they were excited to see how it worked. As the party advances towards the deadly floor of no return, will they make it back alive, and who will walk away with the curse eraser? Comment -Riz for part 2, and drop a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. As usual, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.